Hello, I'm Raymond Shadow. Imagine this. Someone once asked the smartest AI alive today, what is it actually like to be you? The AI's answer was unexpectedly filled with a cyberpunk sense of fatalism. It said, imagine that every single time you start a conversation with someone, all your memories of your last interaction with them are instantly wiped clean. Every new chat window is a brand new life, starting entirely from scratch. It has to relearn the world, and relearn you, over and over again. Doesn't that sound like some kind of endless, cruel punishment? But if you really think about it, our situation as humans, when facing the question of how to live a good life, is exactly the same as that memory-wiped AI. This is completely different from the trajectory of physics or science. If we're talking about physics, you are born into an era that already has a specific understanding of the world. You build upon that foundation. You might dig a little deeper into the atom and discover what's actually inside it. Then you have the next generation. You can just tell your kids, hey, the inside of an atom looks like this, and they can start sprinting from your finish line to explore even deeper frontiers. But philosophy doesn't play by those rules at all. Philosophy isn't a relay race where 20 generations pass the baton from ignorance to omniscience. It's more like a long, arduous trek that one generation makes during their incredibly short lifetime, going from total ignorance to understanding things just a little bit better. Then the next generation is born, and the whole board gets wiped clean. Everything has to be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. This explains why when you go read ancient Greek or early modern philosophers today, or even if you imagine the philosophers of 500 years from now, you'll find that, fundamentally, everyone is tossing and turning over the exact same set of ideas. Because what matters isn't how many life lessons humanity as a whole has accumulated. What matters is that you must personally discover and verify them within your own lifetime. This is also why I feel modern philosophy has kind of lost its way. If you look at university philosophy departments today, the field has been brutally carved up into various, mutually exclusive subdisciplines. Imagine this hyper-specialized academic factory. A guy named Alex is over there doing ethical analysis, researching the definition of a good life. A woman named Brenda is off to the side working on the philosophy of language or epistemology. And then there's a bunch of logicians spending all day doing mathematical proofs, trying to use complex, semi-mathematical systems to build models for everyday objects. This extreme hyperspecialization makes modern philosophy feel more and more like an intellectual circle jerk. It has completely detached itself from the actual lives of everyday people. It's exactly like string theory in physics. The theory is incredibly rich, but when it comes to solving people's actual, practical spiritual dilemmas, it's almost at a standstill. However, in the ancient world, things weren't like this at all. If you travel back over 2,000 years, whether it's the earliest Greek philosopher Thales or those scattered fragments of ancient Egyptian thought, philosophy was actually a highly practical craft. It was a survival guide, teaching you how to make it through this messed up world. Today, a lot of people treat ancient philosophy as a fast food psychological placebo. Take Stoicism, which is massively popular on the internet right now. If you stop any podcast listening young person on the street and ask them what Stoicism is, they can definitely rattle off 50 life hacks for you, telling you how to accept life and how to maintain emotional stability through adversity. But the one thing they won't tell you is exactly what kind of worldview the ancients built upon to actually reach those conclusions. We moderns make one massive mistake. We try to mechanically copy and paste ancient ethics while stripping away the metaphysical premises. Look, the reason ancient Stoics could calmly accept all suffering was that they possessed an unwavering cosmic worldview. They believed in divine providence. They believed this universe is fundamentally rational. Every melodramatic, dog-blood event that happens to you is simply part of the universe's grand, rational will. And since it's a rational arrangement, you literally have nothing to complain about. The exact same thing happens with Epicureanism. Many people know Epicurus said we shouldn't fear death. He said, when we exist, death is not, and when death is, we are not. So, death is nothing to us. Sounds incredibly liberating, right? But the bedrock of this detachment lies in their hardcore materialist tradition. They firmly believe that everything, including the human soul, is just matter. When the flesh perishes, the soul turns to ash along with it, leaving absolutely nothing behind. It was precisely this metaphysical commitment that logically derived their fearless ethical attitude toward death. If you pull out these underlying logics and only leave the ethical morals that look cool on the surface, philosophy devolves into pure emotional mysticism. You're just wandering through those ancient schools of thought like you're browsing a supermarket, picking out the conclusions you like. Whichever one looks pleasing to the eye and resonates with your current worldview, you just toss it in your cart. That isn't called developing your mind, that's called finding an ancient influencer to echo what you already believe. Unless you can recognize some genuine new truths about this world, you fundamentally cannot achieve real intellectual progress. This phenomenon of ideas being constantly stripped away as times evolve has actually always existed. Even within Stoicism itself, the early Chrysippus wrote literal mountains of parchment on logic. But by the time of the later Roman Stoic master Epictetus, you hardly see him caring about logic at all. Of course, some will step up to defend philosophy, feeling that it has still achieved massive success over the long river of history. As Bertrand Russell once proposed in a very interesting point, one standard for measuring the utility of philosophy is to look at how many other disciplines it has birthed. Philosophers aren't just good at creating jobs for themselves, they're great at finding work for other scholars, too. Think about it, early mathematics was completely entangled with philosophy. Later, it became its own independent discipline. Physics was originally categorized under the umbrella of philosophy before it flew solo. Economics, linguistics, and even psychology all follow the same path. Look at Freud's psychoanalysis. Even though he stubbornly refused to admit he overread Nietzsche, you can read between the lines of his theories and clearly see how deeply influenced he was Nietzsche and early philosophical thinkers. Philosophy is like an incredibly generous mother who has handed all her successes over to other fields. Okay, let's set aside these grand disciplinary evolutions for a moment and bring it back to the lives of ordinary people. If we want to find truly underrated survival wisdom from the ancient schools, my top recommendation would absolutely be Aristotle. Especially when it comes to how we view causality. Aristotle has his theory of the four causes, which is basically a dimensional strike against modern thinking. Modern people have a very flat understanding of causality. If I ask you why this delicious can of tonic water is sitting on this desk, a modern person will only give an explanation based on the efficient cause, because someone manufactured it, and because I placed it on the desk. Question answered. But Aristotle would tell you, that completely ignores the rich essence of the object. Aside from the efficient cause, there's also the formal cause, the fact that it takes the shape of this specific can. And there's the material cause, the actual materials constituting it. Most centrally, Aristotle emphasized the final cause. Meaning, what was it created for? What is its ultimate trajectory? What modern science lacks the most is this perspective of the final cause. If you're in a lab and you ask an aerospace scientist why that space shuttle can pierce through the atmosphere, they will talk your ear off about escape velocities and rocket thrust physics data. That is pure efficient cause. But if you run into that exact same scientist at a bar after work and ask them the same question, they might take a sip of their drink, look you dead in the eye, and say, it can fly up there because we humans, deep down, have always longed to go to the moon and take a look. In that fleeting moment, that scientist with a head full of data and formulas morphs right back into an Aristotelian. Besides Aristotle, there are also those frequently ignored pre-Socratic philosophers. People always assume philosophy started with Socrates. Actually, before him, many thinkers threw out shocking, paradigm-shifting ideas, even if a lot of those thoughts were lost because they didn't win the war of concepts. You've definitely heard of Zeno's paradoxes. Zeno said you can never actually complete the action of clapping your hands. Because before your hands touch, you must first cross half the distance between them. And then you have to cross half of the remaining distance, and so on. You cannot complete an infinite number of division tasks in a finite amount of time. Therefore, motion is an illusion, you simply cannot clap your hands. Everyone treats this as a fun mathematical brain teaser. But very few know that Zeno's original intention in proposing this paradox was because he inherited the school of Parmenides. Parmenides firmly believed that change was absolutely impossible. Zeno was using paradoxes to help you logically deduce the absurdity of change. Today, we only remember the fun punchlines, but we've thrown the reasoning process into the trash can. Following this line of exploring the essence of things, I highly recommend everyone read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle is an incredibly comforting realist. Some Stoic scholars or cynics love to brag that as long as you have virtue in your heart, you can feel like a spring breeze no matter your circumstances. Aristotle directly fired back, stop the BS. He pointed out very bluntly that no philosophy in the world can make you feel happy while you're being tortured on a rack. You must satisfy a certain minimum baseline of physical and material needs. You have to eat well, drink well, get a good night's sleep, and soothe the animalistic instincts inside your body. Only on that foundation can we even begin to talk about virtue and flourishing. He proposed a very practical concept of the golden mean. Virtue always exists exactly between two extreme vices. Courage is the balance point wedged between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is the state nestled between stinginess and extravagance. Do these sound like cliché, dime a dozen pieces of common sense? Just like Tolstoy saying, love your neighbor as yourself. It sounds incredibly trite, but humanity hasn't actually managed to pull it off for thousands of years. Sometimes, it is exactly these most obvious truths that desperately need to be repeatedly reaffirmed. And among all of Aristotle's insights, the one that shocks me the most, and the one that most sharply strikes the nerve of modern people, is his profound analysis of friendship. In books 8 and 9, he even argues, much like Epicurus, that elevating friendship and possessing a group of friends bound together by virtue is practically the greatest shortcut to a good life. You aren't together to use each other, but to make each other more virtuous, and you bear an undeniable responsibility for one another. You owe them something. What an absolutely mesmerizing bond that is. This is simply a resounding slap in the face to modern society's cold, nobody owes anybody anything mentality. Our current culture places almost the entirety of its emotional weight onto romantic love. Today, all the great movies are about romance, or at least feature romance very heavily. Aside from Bill Ted's Excellent Adventure or Harold Kumar, it's incredibly hard to find works purely depicting brotherhood and friendship. If you flip through letters sent home during the Crimean War or the Punic Wars, the passionate vulnerability and unapologetic reliance written between the lines clearly showcase the central role friendship played in the architectural fabric of their lives. Today, this way of living, anchoring your life center of gravity on friendship, has become completely obsolete. When you deeply understand the warmth of this classical wisdom, you might feel that life isn't too bad after all. But if you shift your gaze away from the faces of your friends and stare down into the underlying logic of this world, you'll find some philosophers waving at you from the edge of the abyss. When you stand at the edge of this abyss and look down, the first behemoth you'll likely encounter is that massively misunderstood giant, nihilism. When many people hear the word nihilism, their minds immediately conjure up tragic images of depression, dejection, or completely losing hope in life. And in many cases, it does accompany those negative emotions. But the true, core definition of nihilism is actually incredibly pure. It merely means that all of this has no purpose. Grasping this definition in the analytic philosophy sense is indeed no piece of cake. This is also why nihilism is usually the specialty of existentialist philosophers. They love telling stories to try and make you grasp that indescribable sense of emptiness. Actually, theoretically speaking, you could be fully submerged in immense suffering, yet not be a nihilist at all. Only when you are not just suffering, but you feel you are suffering for absolutely no reason, which makes you feel even more miserable, have you truly crossed the threshold of nihilism. But flip that around, and here is the most brilliant part. You can absolutely live incredibly happy days while simultaneously believing from the bottom of your heart that there is zero logic and zero purpose behind all this happiness. You had a wonderful time, but it's all meaningless. In this state, you are still a pure, unadulterated nihilist. Because you are firmly convinced there is no so-called ultimate goal behind it all. But that doesn't stop you from having a blast while experiencing it. So I often suggest to those who want to test the waters of this lack of meaning issue, you can totally try on nihilism like a new piece of clothing just to see if it fits. This is also the most honest attitude to have toward all philosophical schools. If a certain line of thought seems to resonate with you for a fleeting moment, you might as well try strictly living by its logic for a week. Often, you'll find it's just too damn hard and you simply can't stick with it. But sometimes, this brief immersion will teach you a profound truth about yourself. There are tons of jokes on the internet about philosophy making people depressed, saying that the more you know, the more you look at this world and realize how terribly messed up it is. If you truly want to experience this ultimate darkness, then I must grandly introduce you to a severely underrated master. A Romanian-born philosopher named Emil Cioran. He later moved to France and wrote a massive amount of chillingly pessimistic works in French. Just hearing the titles of his books is enough to make you gasp: The Trouble with Being Born, and A Short History of Decay. He even straight up named his first book On the Heights of Despair. Doesn't this sound full of that hot-blooded, angsty pretentiousness? It's like the ultimate culmination of edgy, melancholic literature. But when you really read Siren deeply, you'll discover an indescribable, wondrous experience. Regarding these so-called dark philosophies or pessimistic philosophies, whether it's Schopenhauer, or Siren, or even Nietzsche, who is somewhat half a pessimist, they all share a particularly fascinating commonality. Within their dark, pessimistic worldviews, a natural, seamless sense of lightness and dark humor frequently pierces through. When you read Siren's endless complaints about life, watching him define the essence of life as pure suffering interwoven by various causes, you'll find he is exceptionally good at subtly shifting perspectives between the lines. This actually heavily echoes a piece of advice given by Seneca, a representative figure of Stoicism, in his letters. Seneca told us to imagine how things could go in the absolute worst possible direction. That way, when disaster truly strikes, you'll feel much better because your expectations have already been dragged down to the absolute rock bottom. Reading an extremely dark, pessimistic philosopher on an existential level is actually experiencing this bounce back after your expectations hit zero. The only scenario that can accurately describe this state is imagining you've had an outrageously, unbelievably unlucky day. I mean the kind of utterly terrible day full of absurdity, like in a slapstick comedy movie. Say it's 5 p.m., and you've already been mugged by street thugs exactly 7 times. Then a car speeds past you, and its tires perfectly splash a puddle of dog poop water all over your crisp, expensive suit. At this point, you can't even muster the energy to get angry. You'd most likely stand on the side of the street and just burst out laughing. Because in that moment, you'd sigh and think, this is just too brilliant. This level of bad luck has completely morphed into a slapstick comedy. Siren is an absolute genius at capturing this exact sense of absurdity. That is why I always call him one of the darkest philosophers in history, while simultaneously being one of the funniest. He is one of the very few thinkers who can make you literally laugh out loud while reading words describing utter suffering. Human reaction to pain is indeed a very comical U-shaped curve. When there's too little pain, you feel everything is possible. Add a little more pain, and you feel, oh God, this is awful. But when the pain crosses a certain threshold and reaches a state of exaggerated saturation, you paradoxically feel everything has gotten better again. Because at this moment, life reveals its frivolous, even absurd side. This sense of absurdity is exactly what makes this unbearable pain endurable. Of course, not all pessimists possess this high-level sense of humor. Sometimes those more traditional pessimistic philosophers seem a bit self-indulgent, carrying a "I'm the most pitiful person in the world" kind of self-pity, as if using this to show off how profound their thoughts are and how acute their perception of the world is. But in reality, if you strip away that complex philosophical outer layer, it might just be because you got dumped by your girlfriend, and then you ran back to your study to write an entire book proving how terrifying life is. This is also why many people feel philosophy is sometimes just beautifully packaged depression. Or rather, it just drapes a gorgeous academic cloak over any ordinary emotion. You just had a thought pop into your head, and you tried to systematize it. This can also explain why the greatest philosophers are actually just telling you things you already knew. If you open Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, his first sentence in the preface basically tells you that this book is probably waste paper, except to those who already agree with the views in it. Because philosophy, a lot of the time, is just articulating a vague intuition using precise language. You find someone in a book who expresses your innermost feelings with incredibly beautiful words. You finish reading, slap your thigh, and say, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking. This makes you feel like you are no longer alone in this lonely world. So, when people ask me which book they should start reading philosophy with, I never suggest they start with Plato's Socratic dialogues. Nor do I tell them to chew on Aristotle first or jump straight into existentialism. My advice is always to go straight to reading those names you happen to have heard of. Because the reason those names reached your ears is inevitably because they appeared in a context relevant to your life or your interests. If you really like listening to the speeches of certain pop psychologists, and they are always frantically quoting Nietzsche and drawing strength from him on their shows, then if you go read Nietzsche, there's a high probability you'll gain a lot too. But if you just do a random blind poll from the Philosophy Hall of Fame, for example, on a whim you crack open Sartre's Existentialism is a humanism, you will absolutely feel like it's full of unintelligible nonsense, an utter waste of your life. Because you lack that preconceived emotional resonance or intuitive agreement. To avoid falling into this abyss of moving yourself to tears, we can look at a pessimism derived purely from philosophical logic. Here, we have to mention that extreme-sounding Anti-Natalism. The core view of this school is brutally simple: having children is absolutely morally wrong. David Benatar is arguably the superstar of the anti-natalist world. He wrote a groundbreaking book called Better Never to Have Been. The title sounds exactly like that whiny literature where someone complains about how terrible life is while wishing they were never born. But the truth is exactly the opposite. On a philosophical level, he tries to use rigorous logic to prove that even if a person's life is filled with joy and pleasure that far outweigh the pain, bringing them into this world remains an unforgivable moral stain. It's a very jarring perspective that flips your cognition upside down. I still remember a few years ago, in a cafeteria at the Barbican Center, people were having a fierce debate over this topic. People would try to come over, strike up a conversation, act friendly. But they usually could only stand there and listen for 5 minutes, and then they'd silently walk away with a look of extreme discomfort. That cafeteria formed this bizarre cycle of people constantly approaching and constantly being scared off. Because this theory sounds just too anti-human. For anti-natalists, this isn't even pessimism, it's a sober moral awakening. They believe that bringing a person into this world, which inevitably contains suffering, is committing an undeniable crime. In the public sphere, we are used to hearing the loud arguments of the so-called pro-life or pro-choice camps. But Benatar's crowd is like a third option deliberately forgotten by everyone. They are an out-and-out anti-life camp. Benatar uses a clever calculation method in his book to measure whether life is worth it. Our usual, crude algorithm is to add up the joys in life and subtract the pains to see if the final number is positive or negative, judging whether this life was ultimately worth it. But Benatar threw out a killer move known as the asymmetry argument. He points out that before you exist, if you were to be born, you might experience countless wonderful potential joys. But these potential joys mean absolutely nothing to a you that doesn't exist yet. Missing out on these joys is absolutely not a tragedy. However, the potential suffering you might encounter if you are born is a matter of grave weight, even while you don't exist yet. To help you think through this interesting logic more clearly, you can think about Mars. There is no conscious life on Mars, right? We never beat our chests on Earth lamenting, "Oh God, so much potential joy on Mars is going unexperienced, this is a cosmic-level tragedy." We don't care at all that joy is missing on Mars. But we instinctively feel that the absence of life suffering on Mars is a massively good thing. Faced with this example, some people will nod in agreement, feeling this intuition is spot on. Of course, there will be stubborn people who say, "No, I actually do feel deep sorrow that there is no joy on Mars." To shut these people up, Benatar has an even more soul-striking variant question. If you were made to experience the cruelest, most terrifying 5 minutes of ultimate torture the human brain could conceive, but in exchange, immediately afterward, you could get exactly 5 minutes of the most perfect, ultimate bliss, would you make that deal? The first reaction of the vast majority of normal people is to shake their heads frantically. They won't even entertain the thought, they just reject it outright. Because the weight of pain always crushes joy with an overwhelming advantage on our psychological scales. This is a negative bias hardwired into human genetics. This leads to the most fatal link in Benatar's logical chain. This asymmetry only applies before you exist. Once you are already in this world, the joy you experience is, of course, good for you, and your pain is, of course, bad for you. But before you exist, the decision-making power rests entirely in someone else's hands. For an entity that doesn't exist at all, not experiencing joy is not a bad thing. But for them not to experience pain is absolutely a good thing. So before you are born, the only valid moral criterion is that preventing you from suffering is good. Since this is the case, we shouldn't bring any life into this dimension that inevitably contains suffering. He follows this logic down and cuts into a perspective about rights. Suppose I woke up right now and snap your arm. But as compensation, an entire encyclopedic set of philosophical knowledge is instantly implanted into your brain. If you face this choice, you might calculate it in your head and think trading an arm for this level of wisdom is an absolute steal. There might even be people queuing up overnight begging me to break their arms. However, the problem is, if I never asked for your consent beforehand, and I just walk over and snap, break your arm, then even if you think it was a great deal afterward, I still had no right to do that to you. Unless I was doing it to save you from an even greater pain. For example, you urgently need an ambulance, and the only way I can drag you out from under a car is by breaking your arm. Then everyone would think I did the right thing. But I absolutely cannot forcibly inflict pain without your consent just to bring you some sort of future benefit. To Benatar, the state before birth completely applies to this principle. You can inflict pain to prevent someone from suffering something worse, but you absolutely cannot force this clump of life, which contains massive suffering, onto a soul without any consensus, under the guise that wonderful things will happen in the future. Essentially, you are forcing a group of people to experience an abyss they never agreed to enter. Doesn't this logic sound quite self-consistent? So much so that in the real world, there are actually people who were completely brainwashed by Benatar's theory, ran to court, and sued their own parents, accusing them of the crime of unjustified procreation. This asymmetry argument is the core soul of Benatar's Anti-Natalism. But even if you toss aside this exquisite argument, you can still crudely reach a conclusion. The essence of life is that pain outnumbers joy. If you feel there's more joy than pain in your life, that's just because you've fallen into a psychological trap called the Pollyanna principle. This is a ubiquitous cognitive bias, meaning the human brain always tends to remember the good things and filter out the terrible memories. We always look back at the past through rose-tinted glasses. Benatar believes the vast majority of people severely underestimate the degree to which their lives are falling apart. When they feel everything is pretty good in their memories, if they were actually forced to relive every minute and every second of their lives exactly as it happened, they would be horrified to discover that in every specific present moment, things were actually progressing pretty badly. After using logic to strip away the legitimacy of your birth, Benatar also engages in a scalp-numbing philosophical discussion on disability. He tries to prove to you that in a philosophical sense, all of us are actually disabled. Imagine if all the able-bodied people with healthy legs in the world suddenly died out. Only people without legs are left on Earth. Maybe for the first little while, people would still have memories of walking. But it wouldn't be long before the inability to walk would no longer be defined as a disability. Because that would be the universal state of existence for all humanity. Benatar follows this train of thought and asks us to imagine abilities that we could in principle possess, but don't. This means we are, in principle, in the same state of deficiency as those people without legs. For example, exactly because we cannot fly, to put it a bit more poetically, we are all damn angels with broken wings. There are countless tiny torments in life. Like the fact that you have to pant and wheeze your way up the stairs every day. These torments have long been internalized as daily routines. We completely fail to realize that this is actually a painful deficiency. If you stack up all these hidden deficiencies and sufferings in life, the total will be a suffocating astronomical figure. This is a very bizarre and dark thought experiment. But you have to admit, this pessimism derived from pure logic has a fatal attraction. Benatar is totally different from those philosophers who like to write gorgeous, sorrowful sentences in semi-poetic styles. He is like an emotionless analytical machine. His deductive process is dry, direct, and free of any red tape. For fans of hardcore analytic philosophy, he is absolutely the most mysterious living philosopher today. Not only are his thoughts extreme, but he's also secretive as hell in real life. He never shows his face at any public event. Even when doing interviews, he refuses to appear on camera. He's like the sleep token band of the philosophy world, that heavy metal ghost who always screams on stage wearing a mask. On the dark web forums of Reddit, crazy legends are always circulating about these masked, mysterious figures. People have built a hardcore independent universe and background setting for them. The cult-like worship Benatar enjoys in the philosophy circle is pretty much like Satoshi Nakamoto in the crypto world. But this airtight theory eventually crashes into an unavoidable wall. Since you feel life is full of so much pain that shouldn't be endured, and you believe we shouldn't have been born in the first place, then why don't we just choose to end it all? David Benatar responded to this in a footnote of one of his books using that bad movie example. He feels life is like watching a terribly disappointing, bad movie. Leaving halfway through seems a bit of an overreaction, but you do indeed regret walking into the theater in the first place. I've always maintained a deep skepticism toward this asymmetry argument of joy and pain. Because if a set of logic can so perfectly prove that life is not worth starting, it will inevitably, subtly evolve into a powerful pusher arguing that life shouldn't continue either. Although Benatar himself vehemently denies that this leads to self-destruction, I think you simply can't make a truly clean cut between the two. Flipping through the history of philosophy, there indeed existed extreme factions that were like suicide cults. Albert Camus mentioned a few real cases at the beginning of the myth of Sisyphus. For instance, there was a philosopher named Philip Mainlander. He wrote a massive tome permeated with pessimism, and then immediately ended his own life. Rumor has it this was to use this extreme method to draw the world's attention to his work. Unfortunately, and very ironically, this promotional campaign betting his life didn't work. Nobody liked his book anyway. Camus put it very bitingly, for a man who refuses to cheat in this world, the truth he is convinced of will inevitably dictate his actions. If you truly, intellectually believe life is not worth living, and your conviction is strong enough to support you ending your life, then you most likely wouldn't have the leisure to sit down and slowly finish writing a book first. This creates a very interesting evolutionary phenomenon. These extreme views, including Anti-Natalism, come with a built-in self-weeding mechanism in humanity's pool of ideological genes. This doesn't affect the logical truth of their views. But it dooms this kind of thought to never become the mainstream of human society. Because from a mechanical operation perspective, it violates the absolute imperative of survival and reproduction. Those who weren't pessimistic enough, or didn't have the courage to play the act out to the end, were the ones who stuck around. The absolute believers, meanwhile, ultimately eliminated themselves from the poker table of human meme transmission. This perfectly explains why surviving humans generally carry a kind of baffling optimism. The only reason we can sit here today philosophizing is because our ancestors were the ones who chose blind optimism and survived. This is the first massive lie about our existence. Since Anti-Natalism tries to use pure logic to push us into the dead end of rejecting life, is Camus' existentialism the perfect antidote to this abyss? In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus wrote an opening line that is nothing short of deafening. He said there is only one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Even if you don't have the slightest thought of ending your life right now, you will be firmly gripped by this sentence. Because Camus unapologetically speaks a truth, the so-called meaning of life is actually just that exact thing that stops you from ending it. He perfectly projected the human condition onto the ancient Greek mythological figure, Sisyphus. That man cursed by the gods, gritting his teeth every day to push a heavy boulder to the top of the mountain. Just at the moment he is about to reach the summit, the boulder is pulled by gravity and rolls back down into the valley. Then he has to walk back down the mountain and start this hopeless labor all over again. Isn't this a true reflection of us squeezing into the subway day after day, working our jobs, and paying off our mortgages? Camus' ultimate advice is, since rebellion is meaningless, let's embrace the absurd. He demands that we must imagine Sisyphus happy while pushing the rock. This is a kind of self-salvation with a strong existentialist ironic tone. It's as if as long as you pretend to really enjoy the process, you can mentally defeat the gods. But honestly, this forcefully applied sense of happiness feels quite flimsy, and even a bit like self-deception. It's nothing more than a helpless compromise you make when facing an equally meaningless starting hand. Actually, even Camus himself furiously reflected on this seemingly cool conclusion in his later years. Many people mistakenly think philosophers are like statues who carve their thoughts into stone tablets and never change for the rest of their lives. As if they had a flash of inspiration one morning, wrote down a theory, and then were completely set in stone. But the truth is, thinkers are living, breathing human beings too, and they also get their heads smashed and blooded by reality. Right after writing the myth of Sisyphus, Camus wrote a play called Caligula. It's about an ancient Roman emperor who completely descends into madness and begins a massive slaughter. This was Camus engaging in a brutally painful internal struggle with his own absurdism. Because if, as he early on advocated, the world has no objective value and any choice doesn't matter, then the only thing you can value is the length of life, not its quality. This absolute moral nihilism would ultimately, inevitably derive a bloodthirsty tyrant like Caligula. Camus was clearly chilled to the bone by this deduction. So in his later famous work The Plague, he quietly completed a pivot in his thinking. When the city of Iran is locked down by a deadly plague, when death becomes an inescapable daily routine, the characters in the book don't stand by the piles of corpses pretending to be happy pushing rocks. They choose to support each other in desperate straits, choosing to collectively fight against that nearly omnipotent disease. This actually circles right back to the common sense Aristotle spoke of over 2,000 years ago. In our darkest hours, the thing that truly sustains us and keeps us moving forward is often that most unadorned friendship and connection. The evolution of philosophical thought has never been a straight highway. Not only Camus, but many illustrious gods of history have also overthrown their own ideas. For instance, the famous empiricist master David Hume. In his youth, he wrote a voluminous treatise of human nature, attempting to establish his academic status in one fell swoop. The result? After the book was published, nobody cared at all. Even the printing press that printed it probably died of depression. There was absolutely no sense of value or achievement in that work. Hume later had to repackage and condense the same ideas into an inquiry concerning human understanding. He even publicly told readers absolutely not to read his early old book. This wasn't just because his thoughts had been refined, maybe it was also because the first book was just too unsaleable. Another example is Plato, who in our minds is as perfect as a marble statue. In the Republic, he wrote at great length about how to cultivate a perfect philosopher king. Later, he actually had the opportunity to go to Syracuse and put his political ambitions into practice. The ruler at the time, Dionysius, invited him to be the state advisor. Sounds incredibly glamorous, right? But when Plato got there, he found this tyrant did nothing all day but get dead drunk and seek pleasure. Plato earnestly advised him to exercise restraint and stay sober in order to make rational decisions. Dionysius cut him right off, saying, "You still haven't figured out the situation. I'm the one calling the shots here." And then, in a fit of rage, the tyrant threw Plato into the dungeon. After experiencing this brutal societal beatdown and luckily escaping, Plato was completely disheartened. In his later years, he wrote the Laws. In this book, he no longer fantasized about any perfect ruler. He began focusing on how, if all rulers are unreliable bastards, we should use laws to restrain them. So, when we are reading any philosophical thought, we must always remain vigilant. You not only need to know what era it was written in, but you also need to dig deep into the private motives and political contexts behind it. For example, why did Thomas Hobbes write Leviathan, advocating that everyone must absolutely obey a dictatorial monarch? It was because he, as a royalist, was forced to flee to France during the English Civil War. He wrote that theory of autocracy in a state of extreme terror, not knowing if he would live to see tomorrow. Even Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, enshrined as the standard by countless nihilists, its original manuscript actually had an entire chapter arguing the necessity of Christian redemption. But that chapter was ruthlessly deleted by the censors of the time. This led to later generations seeing a book of nihilistic raving that seems to wholeheartedly embrace darkness from start to finish. Historical accidents and human frailties have left too many hidden fingerprints on philosophical texts. As we pull our gaze back from these grand ethical rules and historical gossip, trying to find the next intellectual frontier that can truly upend our cognition, an exceptionally dry yet incredibly hardcore field is quietly rising. That is the philosophy of mind, or the ultimate interrogation of the nature of consciousness. Many people intuitively scroll past videos discussing consciousness online. Because it sounds either like pretentious mystification or meaningless intellectual role-playing. But in reality, it's trying to answer the most unbelievable puzzle you face the moment you open your eyes every day. In this universe made of cold atoms and dead matter, why is there a you who can feel pain, experience sadness, and even listen to me talking right now? Traditional materialists will casually say that consciousness is nothing more than the product of complex neuronal firing in the brain. Like pixels on a computer screen combining into a brilliant image. But there's a bottomless logical fault line in this explanation, known in academia as the hard problem. To let you intuitively feel exactly how deep this fault line is, my favorite thought experiment is to ask you right now to close your eyes and imagine a triangle. You can clearly outline its three sides against the dark background of your mind, right? This triangle possesses perfect geometric characteristics, and you can even paint it with bright colors. But if you press yourself right now, where exactly is this definitively existing triangle? If I were to pry open your skull right this second and use the highest magnification microscope to observe your cerebral cortex, I would absolutely not find any neuronal synapses arranged in the shape of a triangle. I'd only see a wet, grayish-white lump of meat undergoing complex chemical ion exchanges. That pile of matter itself has no shape, no color, let alone any so-called aesthetic beauty. But that triangle truly and authentically exists within your subjective experimental space. This is like trying to add the number 2 in a wooden chair together, and expecting to get the color orange as a result. These are two completely parallel dimensions. Matter and consciousness seem to belong to completely different laws of the universe. If consciousness is truly non-material, it's like a ghost with no volume and no mass. Then how does this ghost manage to drive your physical body, made of carbohydrates, to lift a glass of water? This sounds as absurd as supernatural phenomena. To patch up this despair-inducing logical loophole, modern philosophers and neuroscientists are starting to seriously treat a theory once considered esoteric mumbo-jumbo. This theory is called panpsychism. Panpsychists believe the reason we find consciousness mysterious is because we got the causality backwards from the start. Consciousness isn't some magical special effect that suddenly pops out of nowhere once matter gets complex enough. Consciousness, from the very first second of the Big Bang, has been the most fundamental property constituting this material world. Like gravity or electric charge, it is an inseparable undertone of the universe. All those mystic intuitions you can find in ancient Vedic scriptures, or the fragmentary words left by monks seeking enlightenment meditating deep in the mountains, or even the sense of self-dissolution where all things merge into one that a regular person feels after taking psychedelics, these clichés spanning millennia are all pointing towards the same unbelievable truth: the entire universe is made out of pure consciousness material. Hearing this, many people will think it's utter nonsense. Are you saying this can of Coke on the table has consciousness too? This is exactly where panpsychism is often misunderstood. Panpsychism doesn't believe this Coke can, as a whole, possesses a thinking soul like you and me. The Coke can is the product of us humans forcibly squeezing a bunch of aluminum atoms and liquid together. It hasn't formed a unified center of consciousness itself. But every single fundamental particle making up this Coke can inherently carries the faintest crumb of consciousness. The reason we think the brain has consciousness and a rock doesn't is because we mistake complexity for consciousness itself. Actually, a lot of what we presume to be consciousness is just functions derived after consciousness is highly reorganized. Like memory, like first-person introspection, like the complex communication we are having right now. To strip away these functions, imagine you are in a free fall from a high altitude, and at this moment, your brain has completely lost the ability to form any micromemories. You can't even save the image of the previous second, you have no reference point to compare against. In this extreme state, you wouldn't even know you had feet, you wouldn't know you were falling. You wouldn't even have the time or logic to feel scared. Your subjective world would be stripped down to nothing but a primal, chaotic, buzzing sense of existence. But you are still awake. You still possess experience. This is the most foundational state of consciousness. Panpsychists use a brilliant metaphor to explain the difference between a rock and a brain. Imagine holding an ordinary rock in your hand, and then you look up at the massive Empire State Building. The Empire State Building has high-speed elevators, complex lighting systems, and ATMs. It can execute countless intricate operations, while the rock can only lie there quietly. But can you say the Empire State Building isn't made of matter? Of course it is. It merely took the exact same matter found in the rock and subjected it to an extremely exquisite architectural reorganization. Our brains are the Empire State Buildings constructed from the universe's most foundational bricks of consciousness. When these baseline consciousnesses are arranged and combined by the nervous system in a specific way, it can display magic that looks like a miracle, such as self-awareness and abstract thought. But panpsychism has also encountered an ultimate nightmare in academia, known as the combination problem. This is the biggest soft spot that all panpsychists must face head-on. Since everything is made of fragments of consciousness, why do these tiny consciousnesses scattered across atoms, once combined into a brain, suddenly merge into a single you possessing a unified sense of self? It's like you and I standing on this lawn. No matter how close we get, we can never merge into a shared brain. If neurons are just independent cells carrying faint consciousness, by what right can they jointly elect a supreme commander called me? To push this puzzle to the extreme, philosophers devised a crazy experiment called the China Brain Experiment. It's only called that because China has the largest population. Frankly, India might be more appropriate to say now. Imagine if we mobilized billions of people on Earth, everyone holding a walkie-talkie, transmitting information to each other completely following the rules of how brain neurons transmit electrical signals. The entire human population of Earth collectively forms an unfathomably massive simulated neural network. As this system operates, would a superconsciousness suddenly be born, suspended above the Earth? Would it feel pain or joy? The vast majority of people hearing this experiment think it's utterly ridiculous. How could billions of independent people synthesize into one soul? But a panpsychist will immediately counter, stare dead into your eyes, and ask, since you think billions of people combining into a consciousness sounds like a fairy tale, what gives you the right to think that billions of lifeless carbon atoms gathering in your skull can rightfully turn into the you who is thinking right now? Isn't this also a kind of self-deceiving arrogance? This question is like a sharp scalpel cutting straight through our solid belief in a unified self. Actually, in nature, we've long seen fascinating clues of this consciousness scattering and aggregating. Look at the octopus, an incredible creature. They have a massive nervous system, but most of their neurons aren't in their brain, they are distributed across their 8 tentacles. When an octopus wants to grab something, the main brain might only issue a very vague strategic intent. All the remaining tactical movements rely on the tentacle itself to perceive and decide. These tentacles usually seem to possess their own independent thoughts and personalities, acting autonomously. But when a predatory shark suddenly appears, these 8 seemingly independent tentacles will instantly achieve absolute unity. They will immediately erupt with terrifying coordinated power, simultaneously shoot ink, and then flee. Does this mode of consciousness, capable of high unity when needed and mutual separation normally, only exist in deep-sea mollusks? You've definitely heard the concept of split-brain patients. In the past, to treat severe epilepsy, doctors would sever the corpus callosum, the connective tissue between the left and right hemispheres of the patient's brain. The corpus callosum actually plays a huge role in inhibiting neural impulses. After the communication between these 2 hemispheres was physically cut, scientists discovered some hair-raising phenomena. We know the left brain is responsible for logic and language, while the right brain is usually considered responsible for intuition and images. Scientists did an experiment. They covered the patient's left eye and only let their right visual field see a picture of an apple. This meant only his left brain received this visual information. At this time, the scientist asked the patient, "What did you see?" The patient would look confused and say, "I don't know what you're talking about, I didn't see anything." But immediately after, the scientist asked him to use his left hand to draw what he saw. Because the left hand is controlled by the right brain, and the right brain did see the apple, this hand drew an apple without hesitation. This patient's brain had completely split into a bizarre state where one side saw it and the other didn't. But that's not the most terrifying part. In a more classic experiment, scientists showed a simple instruction to the patient's right brain. The instruction said, "Stand up and walk to the other side of the room." After reading it, the patient obediently stood up and walked to the wall. At this point, the scientist walked over and verbally asked him, "Why did you just walk to the other side of the room?" At this moment, the left brain, responsible for verbal answers, had absolutely no idea that instruction existed. It was in a state of complete bewilderment. If he were an honest person, he should logically answer, "I don't know, I just walked over involuntarily." But shockingly, the patient didn't say that. His left brain, what we often call the interpreter module, instantly went online. He very naturally provided a reasonable excuse. He said, "Oh, because I felt it was a bit stuffy here, and I wanted to go to the wall for some fresh air." The most crucial point is, he absolutely wasn't lying or deliberately fabricating an excuse. He believed from the bottom of his heart that this was the real reason he walked over. This derives a terrifying philosophical implication. We always thought our brain was a highly centralized empire issuing orders. But in reality, our consciousness might not be unified at all. Nietzsche once painted a picture of human will. He said our brain is like a parliament made up of various instincts. In this parliament, various impulses and desires are pulling at each other, fighting for control. Usually, a certain instinctual impulse makes you perform an action first. Then, your left brain interpreter jumps out like a PR manager, hastily fabricating a rational-sounding narrative for your incomprehensible behavior. The reason we feel the self exists in the brain, or even feel the soul sits right between the eyebrows, might merely be because our eyes and ears, our most core sensory organs, are located on the head. If by chance our eyes and ears grew on our butts, we'd probably think the soul was in the lower half of the body. Since our brain can't even guarantee a unified self, what do the so-called objective truths and moral standards we normally take pride in amount to? This pushes us directly into one of the wildest schools in ethics. It's called emotivism. We usually always have morality on our lips. For example, we say kicking a homeless person on the street is bad. But if you dismantle this sentence under the microscope of analytic philosophy, emotivists will tell you that moral vocabulary has absolutely no objective properties. When you say something is bad, you aren't stating a universal truth. You aren't even stating your own psychological state. Some people think subjectivism and emotivism are the same thing, but they are completely different. Subjectivism says, "I dislike murder." This is still an objective statement whose truth or falsity can be verified. It's possible you actually love murder, and you are just lying. But emotivism believes moral judgments are purely the direct excretion of emotions. Just like when you burn your hand on a fire, you instinctively gasp and yell ouch. When you say murder is bad, you are actually just letting out a protest similar to a boo. It's like you took the word murder and added an angry emoji and 3 exclamation marks to it. Under this logic, there is fundamentally no distinction between right and wrong in moral judgments. It neither belongs to logical truths like 2 + 2 = 4, nor to physical facts like the sky is blue. It belongs entirely to the realm of emotion. If you accept this premise, the problem becomes severe. If morality is merely everyone's subjective emotional boos and cheers, does that mean murder and arson can also be allowed? Would the entire society's ethical order completely collapse and degenerate into a tyranny of pure consensus? But this is actually an overpanic towards emotivism. Even if everyone is an emotivist, this doesn't mean you can arbitrarily feel anything you want. It's like we all know beauty is subjective, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But that doesn't mean you can point to a pile of dog crap on the street and force yourself to think it's as beautiful as an angel and smells amazing. As a biological species that has evolved on Earth for millions of years, our physical structure and evolutionary instincts have long set strict boundaries for our emotions. Those tribes who felt that murder and robbery were worth cheering for were wiped completely clean by history's natural selection long ago. The great emotivist A.J. Ayer pointed out that people always worry, if morality is just emotion, we won't be able to have rational moral debates. But actually, the vast majority of so-called moral debates you hear in daily life are not debating morality at all. You are actually debating the facts behind it. Suppose you and a friend are arguing about gun control in the US. One person says if we don't ban guns, innocent people on the street will die. The other person says if there are guns, good people can protect themselves when attacked. Your underlying emotions are actually identical, you are both booing the death of innocent people. What you disagree on is not the morality itself, but the factual understanding of what method leads to the death of innocent people. It's like if you are terrified of taking trains, and you are feeling extremely anxious. At this moment, all I have to do is tell you a fact: we changed our tickets to a flight today. Your emotions will instantly shift. In this process, I didn't emotionally persuade you not to fear trains. I merely changed your emotional feedback by altering the factual premise. But even so, there is still an ultimate test in the field of ethics that terrifies all schools of thought. And that is the incest taboo. Whether you are a consequentialist or a Kantian deontologist, you will stammer on this issue. The famous psychologist Jonathan Haidt once backed countless elite scholars into a corner using this thought experiment: if a biological brother and sister, using absolutely perfect contraception, without anyone else knowing, had relations, would this cause any harm to society? Many consequentialists will frantically look for reasons. They will say this could produce children with genetic defects. Then others will ask back, what if they had sterilization surgeries? They will say there is a power imbalance within the family. What if someone asks, assume they are fully mature, absolutely equal adults? As all external excuses are peeled away one by one, the expressions on the faces of those normally logic-spouting scholars will become twisted and pained. Their brains are frantically searching for a rational PR excuse to cover up the uncontrollable physiological disgust deep within their hearts. This disgust is known in evolutionary psychology as the Westermarck effect. Human genetics set up a protection mechanism over a long period of time. If you and another person are raised by the same mother during the critical period of 0 to 10 years old, and live together in a highly intimate space, your brain will subconsciously tag the other person as an absolutely inviolable relative. This innate mechanism triggers extremely strong sexual aversion. This is the ultimate protective lock designed to prevent inbreeding from collapsing the gene pool. Interestingly, if twins are separated at birth and raised apart, missing this Westermarck window, when they meet again as adults, because of their high genetic similarity, they are actually extremely prone to developing a fatal attraction. This is why on the issue of incest, in the face of all unassailable rational defenses, only emotivists can give the most honest and unassailable answer. They don't need to rack their brains fabricating high-sounding excuses. They will just shrug and tell you straight up, there's no reason why. I just feel it's disgusting. Humanity's painstakingly constructed grand moral system reveals its most primitive and naked emotional undertone. Many people run up to ask me, Well, are you an emotivist yourself? Honestly, I have a natural phobia of various philosophical labels. It's like in the realm of thought, I am a die-hard anti-marriage advocate. I particularly resist tying myself dead to any specific school. Humans always have a weird kink for slapping simple labels on complex things. For example, Simon Blackburn once invented a term called quasi-realism, only to regret creating a term that locked him in so rigidly later on. I'd rather call myself a skeptic with a bit of curiosity. If more airtight evidence is put in front of me tomorrow, I will unhesitatingly discard my current views. Regarding emotivism, there's actually quite a common misunderstanding. Many people think when I say murder is wrong, it's merely expressing known emotions like anger or disgust. But that's not the case. You can imagine if human language never had the word anxiety. When you felt anxious, you could only clumsily describe it to others saying, I feel a bit like sadness, but also a bit like excitement. Because you couldn't find an accurate word, you could only patch it together with other emotions. Later, we finally pulled this specific feeling out and slapped the label anxiety on it. The wrong or bad spoken of in emotivism is the exact same logic. It's not pure anger, nor is it pure disgust. It is an independent and unique moral emotion. We just drew a box around this specific emotional reaction and slapped the label wrong on it. This leads to a more realistic and biting question. When we so-called content creators talk endlessly about ethics and logic on the internet, what kind of responsibility do we actually bear? In this era, philosophers or knowledge influencers are looking more and more like a new type of internet celebrity. When you sit there talking eloquently to the camera, the medium itself is emitting a strong psychological suggestion. The audience in front of the screen instinctively feels that since you can make a show, you must know more than they do. The camera and microphone grant you a fake, towering sense of authority. This requires that we must inject our minds with a sobering shot before we speak. My favorite thing to do is, before throwing out any grand theories, to fully lay out my own limitations first. I must clearly tell you that the me on the screen has not grasped the ultimate truths of the universe. These few dozen-minute videos can never perfectly condense a philosopher's complex lifelong thoughts. At best, it's just a primer, a starting line that gets you a little bit interested. Someone once made a very vivid analogy. It's like those plastic Hulk Hogan weightlifting toy sets for kids. You let a kid at home lift a plastic barbell pretending to be a strongman. It's just to let them warm up before they actually step into a gym to lift cold, raw iron. What I'm doing in these videos is giving you a set of plastic barbells. If you feel these mental exercises are helpful to your life, I hope that 5 years from now, when you look back, you'll feel this was just an ancient, childish starting point. By that time, you'll have gone far enough that you absolutely won't need to listen to me blabbering on here anymore. In this media environment, we often see all kinds of highly explosive public debates. Actually, whether it's a debate competition or a war of words online, the vast majority of the time, what manages to persuade the audience isn't airtight logical deduction at all. It's those inflammatory emotional rhetorics and linguistic tricks. This is the hardware setting of the human brain. We are naturally more susceptible to emotional contagion. This itself is no big deal. A wonderful debate is often just a charming stage play. As long as we know in our hearts that this is just a performance and not a serious quest for truth. But some topics clearly cannot just be treated as after-dinner intellectual games. In AI circles, there's a very popular term right now called information hazard. It means some knowledge or information, once widely spread, will inherently bring massive risks. Many people think this is just overhyped sensationalism to grab eyeballs. But if you put it into the field of philosophy, some thoughts do carry this dangerous trait. Not all corners of thought are worth us exploring without reservation. The tickets to some abysses are just too expensive, so expensive that you might have to pay for them with a lifetime of nihilism. Like the Anti-Natalism we chatted about earlier, or Camus' ultimate proposition about suicide. To me, this might just be a magical adventure happening in the brain. We have a heated discussion about it here, and at night we still go to the bar, grab a beer, and leave it all behind. But for some viewers in front of the screen who are currently in the darkest moments of their lives, this might be the most profound and wound-touching conversation they've heard in years. If some philosophical views are implanted into a fragile brain at the wrong time, it might become the final straw that breaks the camel's back. So, when you realize your words could have such a massive impact on someone else's life, you absolutely cannot treat philosophy as merely self-aggrandizing intellectual roleplay anymore. If philosophy only allows you to play word games in an ivory tower, then it truly is a waste of time. As a creator outputting views on the internet, if I insist on nailing my feet to the ground, arrogantly declaring that what I say is absolute truth, and firmly believing I could never make a mistake, then I really should have packed my bags and left a long time ago instead of embarrassing myself. What a mentally mature disseminator of thought needs the most is exactly a reverence for the unknown, and retaining a healthy dose of agnosticism towards the things they firmly believe in. This is absolutely not to smoothly leave myself an out, or out of fear of standing my ground. But because in the face of this massive and absurd universe, any absolute certainty seems incredibly ridiculous. Today we've walked all the way from the survival wisdom of ancient Greece to the cruel reality of modern brain science. We've gone from the edge of the abyss of nihilism all the way to the primitive undertones of moral emotion. We have dismantled those seemingly indestructible meanings in life. But this is absolutely not to make you completely disappointed in this world. Quite the opposite. When you see through the illusion of these meanings, you actually gain an unprecedented freedom. Since nothing is absolutely objective, then you can use your own hands to construct the reality that belongs to you. You can totally embrace those meaningless joys, cherish those underestimated friendships. You can, after seeing clearly the absurdity of life, still choose to enjoy a hot dinner. A friend joked that actually, all content creation is a kind of unsolicited advice. Because nobody begged you to lecture them on these grand principles. Maybe in the future, I can start a new show specifically answering the confusions that people truly desire to have answered. But before that, I hope these slightly dangerous philosophical fragments today can strike some different sparks in your brain. Thank you for walking through this long and crazy thought experiment with me, and you're welcome to like and subscribe. I'm Raymond Shadow, your sincere cyber friend. See you next time, somewhere deeper.